perhaps even water. Yeah, fantastic, fantastic. Very sharp fruit, absolutely. You guys had your coffee this morning. I had a couple extra ones, so I'm going to be a little bit jittery. Alright, so what do you want to talk about first? Who likes trees? You like trees, we're talking about trees. Unreal. So you look at the right hand side of the boat over here, there are trees. Trees make a forest. Forests are fun. What you're going to notice first, probably, about these forests is that we've run out of any sort of deciduous tree growth. We don't have anything up here in the way of aspens or poplars. We have climbed up into what we call the subalpine ecoregion. Now there's 3 different ecoregions that make up these mountainous ecosystems. Down the valley bottom in the town site of Jasper, we have the montane ecoregion. That's where you're going to find the majority of plant and animal life, and the biggest diversity of plant and animal life. Things like deciduous trees grow down there. Once you climb up here above 1,600 vertical meters, you end up in the subalpine ecoregion. That's where we find ourselves just now. And so up here we still have a large variety of plant and animal species, but it's a little bit more limited, as things up here tend to stay a lot colder for a lot more of the time. So we don't have any of those deciduous trees because our growing season is so much shorter. And when you keep going up and up and up, past 2,200 meters, you start running out of trees entirely. That is what we call the alpine ecoregion. Up there, things are very limited in their growing season and in their diversity of what can exist up in those places. Being as we're in the subalpine ecoregion here between 1,600 and 2,200 vertical meters, we are going to be mostly talking about that. So these trees, they're pretty old. The subalpine ecoregion up here, we anticipate having a burn cycle to keep our forest healthy approximately every 70 years. Now I say approximately. Some regions in the Rockies take a little bit longer than that to burn, some take less. There's not a whole lot of research up here in the Maligne Valley as to the burn cycle of the trees because of how remote the area is. But we can draw information from the Bow Valley, where the towns of Banff and Canmore sit, where we do know that a burn cycle set by the early indigenous peoples was anywhere between 5 and 50 years. Now there's a couple questions that arise from that. Why is burning so important? Why did it have to happen so regularly? And a big part of the reason is that these trees just don't have a very long lifespan to begin with. So out here we've got trees that are approximately 130 years old, and given our average of about 70 years, that's almost twice their natural lifespan. Now, a few different things have happened because of this. When you look out at the forest, it looks very beautiful, but it's extremely unhealthy. The trees dominate the landscape. They've grown very tall, very close together, and that's created a canopy effect over the forest floor, which is just fine for the eastern deciduous woodlands, but not so much out here. These trees are very much inedible, save for the moose, which can digest conifer needles. So what that means is that the canopy effect is stopping the growth of small leafy plants and berry bushes and such, which is the food that's required for the majority of our animals up here, things like deer and bears. And so that makes life fairly tough for them. Now, coming up from the town site of Jasper, no doubt you guys saw an awful lot of brown trees. Yeah? Those are what we call lodgepole pine trees. They're a fire successional tree, and they're being affected as well by the age of these forests. So those older trees, they can come under attack from a non-invasive beetle called the mountain pine beetle. You guys might have heard of that. We got big problems with the pine beetle up here in Canada just now, as well as down in the States. Lots of areas are being affected by that, and that is a direct relationship with the average age of our forest. We've been practicing fire suppression for over 100 years now, since the Park Services started to take over certain landscapes like this, which at the time seemed like a great idea, you know, because forest fires don't look good. They're very destructive. They're very dangerous for us. We didn't even understand how essential that they were. Now we've come a little bit too far, so the native mountain pine beetle originally would wander through the forest and it would colonize the oldest trees, and it would keep the forest young and sort of rejuvenated. What it does is it burrows into the bark, and the larvae eat the cambium on the inside of the bark, which is the nutrient transport network. And so once that's gone, the tree can no longer survive. It was a very much natural cycle, but the lack of too many old trees would keep the population of the beetle under control and everything pretty much in balance. Now we're seeing so many old trees that if you look off to the shore just about anywhere, you're going to see an awful lot of browning trees that is fairly unnatural. So that is the mountain pine beetle taking effect and taking out these older forests. Down in the Jasper town site, we see up to 60% of the whole forest having already been taken over. But it's a natural cycle, as I say. Mother Nature knows that the forests are too old. She knows that things are out of balance. And so this is her way of trying to restore that balance. Killing off some trees, getting more sunlight to the forest floor, so that those small leafy plants and berry bushes can grow up and provide food for the animals living out here. Now the indigenous people, they very much understood the need for this fire. So they would regularly set fires on their own to burn certain sections of the forest in small amounts to keep that forest young and rejuvenated. In doing this, having a record, essentially, of where the leafy plant growth was, they also had a pretty good idea of where all the wildlife hangs out. And because of their practice of traditional hunting, they were essentially farming the land for wild game. They had a lot of things figured out. We're going to keep on with our story. In just a moment here, we're about to have a lake crossing with the Curly Phillips, biggest boat in our fleet, so get ready for a nice bump. Going to get any bigger than that, folks. So the indigenous peoples, we've got a lot of history up here. They understood the ecosystem. They understood the need for fire cycles, how to live out in these places. And reason is that they've been here for thousands and thousands of years. Now, we don't have exact timelines as to when the first indigenous peoples would have come here to the Maligne Valley. However, once again, in the less remote areas, such as the Bow Valley down near Banff, we do have some excellent evidence. In the Vermilion Lakes area, we've got evidence of things like spear points and cutting tools dating back to 13,000 years ago. Very long time ago. Very long time ago. So lots of indigenous history up here in these areas. Now there's a really harsh climate up here at Maligne. As I mentioned, we're in the subalpine ecosystem. What that means is that things get very cold here and they stay cold for a long time. The indigenous people, of course, knew this. Being largely nomadic, we believe that they would have gained access to these places through the summer months to do things like foraging and hunting, practicing ceremony. We're going to get into that a little bit later. But just on the other side of this ridge over here is the place that we believe them to have accessed this area. It's called the Maligne Pass. It's not anything that is very significant for you to see, but it does connect this valley with the Icefields Parkway, which I'm sure several of you drove up on. So that was part of what we call the Stony Trail, and what they call the Stony Trail. And that was their method, their very large trail network that they used when traversing through these mountains, making their way along to different areas that they found culturally significant, as well as for different areas where they would find things like medicinal plants over in this valley, maybe a very rich population of bighorn sheep in this valley. So it was always a very cyclical movement. When they came up here in the summertime, this was one of their favorite places. Now, as I say, they wouldn't have stayed up here year-round. The climate up here is very intense. Show of hands, who thinks this lake freezes over in the wintertime? Just a couple of you. Well, those few of you are absolutely right. This entire lake freezes shore to shore, tip to tip, all 22 kilometers of it for 7 months out of the year. 7 months out of the year. It's an awful long time. That's a good question. How thick is the ice? When this lake freezes, when we get those serious cold snaps, we can see up to 1 meter of ice cover. And we got another weight crossing coming up there with the Talana. Now 1 meter or 3 feet of ice might not be significant to an awful lot of folks that don't have experience with frozen lakes. A person can very comfortably walk on about 4 inches. So 1 meter of ice is thick enough that you could very literally land a plane on that or drive a freight train right across it. Good question, right? The question is, do they do any ice fishing up here? No, they do not. Ice fishing is a very popular activity here in Canada, and theoretically you could. However, within the national park, the season closes around mid-September. Along with all that ice cover comes a whole whack of snow. We can see 2 to 3 meters or 6 to 9 feet of snow down here at the valley bottom, and an awful lot more up high in the Alpine in those rocky areas that we're seeing on Mount Sampson over here on our left-hand side. So pretty tough winter conditions. Fires in the summer, crazy snow and ice in the winter, and cold as well. Up here at Maligne, we've got an average winter temperature of about minus 11 degrees Celsius, which is about 12 degrees Fahrenheit. But our coldest recorded temperature ever, a number of years back, was recorded by a park warden that lived up here in the winter at the time. It was negative 56 degrees Celsius, which is about negative 74 Fahrenheit. That's what I like to call cold. So reasons like this are why the indigenous people would not have lived up here year-round. They would have definitely stayed very much in cold climates, being in the foothills of the Rockies, the eastern foothills, where the temperatures do dip close to that in the wintertime, but on less frequent of occasions. It's much more manageable out there.
How do they make it through that cold season then, hunting-wise? Or they have everything prepared?
They have a lot of stuff prepared for sure. It's a good question. So the question is, how do they make it through that cold season? They're very, very experienced in terms of preserving meats, preserving berries and such, as well as fishing becomes definitely a staple of their diet through the wintertime on some of those eastern lakes. Whitefish has traditionally been an enormously important food source for many indigenous groups east of here, as well as way north all the way to the coast. Anybody else have any questions? I like questions. Anybody? No? Okay. So all that snow can do a couple of crazy things. It's caused, in the melt season here, in the spring, our water level to rise quite significantly, about 2.5 feet here on the lake. And that'll continue to drain out for the majority of the season. Now, that meltwater is quite significant. You guys passed Medicine Lake on the way up here, that other really big one, right? About a month ago, that lake was completely empty. There's one small river that runs through the middle of it all winter long, but that's what we call a disappearing lake. I don't know if you guys noticed, but when you were driving up, you were following a nice river, and then at some point you might have noticed that the river disappeared. There is no outflow river from Medicine Lake. It was dammed by a rock slide many, many years ago. And so that lake fills up in the spring melt right now, and then very slowly drains underground throughout the year in what we call a karst system, which is a network of caves and tunnels made up by large boulders that have fallen and then compacted within each other and sealed off that system. And then at some point further on down the way, that stream re-emerges as the Maligne River, which drains out into the Maligne Canyon once again. We call it Medicine Lake. The indigenous folks called it Magic Lake. The translation for Stony to English, the words medicine and magic are extremely close. That's why it's called Medicine Lake. It was just a bit of a miscommunication. Now as well, when that snow's kicking around here in the wintertime, we see an awful lot of effects happening up high in the mountains. So if you look off to the left-hand side, this is Mount Sampson, the great big one. It's rather impressive. Now if you look just below it, there's an awful lot of clear spots where there's not much in the way of trees growing. You guys see all that there? This is pretty significant. What these are avalanche chutes, meaning that pretty much every time it snows, the snow builds up on such a steep slope as that, the weight becomes too much for the cohesive potential of that snow, and it has to come tumbling down where it lands here very regularly. And they come down with such intense force that no trees can actually grow there long enough to become significant, as they just get knocked over again. All around the rock Rockies, we get thousands of avalanches every single year. And immediately out the left-hand side of the boat just here, you see evidence of an avalanche that we had about a week ago. This last kind of big patch of snow just down here was actually seen falling from the top of that mountain by one of the boat cruises out there at the time. I don't know if that looks like a lot to you guys, but that's a lot of snow. The base of that is probably still 2 to 3 meters deep. And in the springtime, we get very dangerous avalanches because of how heavy they are. In the months of January and February, things are still very much cold. The snow is light and powdery. And what that means is that when it comes falling down, there's not a lot of weight behind it, but it's moving exceptionally fast. An avalanche like this one coming off of Mount Sampson can reach 250 kilometers an hour. In the spring here, avalanches will only move about 25 to 30 kilometers an hour, but the destructive potential is way more because snow has melted, that water has been absorbed by the rest of the snow, and it just continues to accumulate weight into a denser and denser snowpack that eventually comes tumbling down. So the backcountry skiers really have to be careful in the springtime. And I talk a lot about winter. Winter's pretty significant up here. As I said, we've got 7 months of winter every single year. It's a whole big thing. We can have snow days anytime throughout the year, literally any month. I've been on top of mountains where you get hit with a snowstorm and you have to hunker down for 20 minutes until it passes. So the winter's pretty significant. And up here at Maligne, we are a glacially carved valley. Glaciers are very significant. Glaciers are formed by snow compacting on top of each other and the extreme weight of all that snow squeezing all the air voids out of that snow to form ice. Now we do have several glaciers that are going to be there for us to see on the tour. The first one, right out the left-hand side of the boat, just over here. If you look past the shoulder of Mount Sampson, we are going to see a little finger of the second biggest glacier that feeds our lake. This is called the Maligne Glacier. We'll keep talking about that just after we pass the Chaba 3 on our left-hand side. Everyone wave hi. Hello, Chaba. Not going to be much of a weight crossing, but feel free to get excited if you want to. So the Maligne Glacier, just up here, a very beautiful chunk of ice. Does everybody see it? Yeah. Fantastic. If anybody doesn't, it's tucked right up there in the Sandpiper Valley, just between Mount Sampson and the Maligne Mountain, which picks back up. Now that's between 5 and 6 kilometers away from us. We're right about 3 miles, just a little over 3 miles. So it's a little ways off, right? But it still looks huge. And it is huge. As I said, second biggest that feeds the lake here. What we're looking at is a vertical face of probably about 100 meters thick of ice. A lot of ice. A lot of ice. Now, would you believe me if I said that what we're looking at there is only 5% of that glacier? 5%. We've got several colleagues that have climbed up Mount Sampson here and gotten a perfect aerial view of that glacier. They say it looks like a hand spread across the mountain with the fingers in adjacent valleys. What we're seeing there is just the very tip of one of the fingers. I'll let you guys decide for yourselves which finger. I'm just kidding, it's the pinky. Get your minds out of the gutter. Now look around, folks. The glaciers give us a lot of benefits here at the lake. They do a lot of stuff for us. I want you to take note of the color of the water just now. Okay? It's a very beautiful color. It's got more of a green tint to it. So just make note of that. Keep it in your mind. Now that we're coming a little ways down the lake, we've got Mount Sampson on our left. This is Mount Unwin over here on our right. These are both part of the same mountain range. When you guys are on your way up, you passed another mountain range. It was called the Maligne Range on your right-hand side. That one starts in the town side of Jasper and comes all the way up here. It's very much in a linear fashion, just like the vast majority of mountain ranges. We're going to be very blessed to be at our destination where we're surrounded almost 360 degrees by the very same mountain range called the Queen Elizabeth. It's an extremely rare circumstance where it hooks back on itself. So we are approaching one of the best collection of peaks in the entirety of the Rocky Mountains. I see a number of you guys have figured it out already. There is a second glacier up in these mountains. Given their elevation and the limestone composition, it's the perfect place for glaciers to form and to remain for quite a long time. So just after we pass this first island of our tour, which is very conveniently named First Island, you are going to get a full unobstructed view of 95% of the Charlton Unwin Glacier. Now the Charlton Unwin Glacier, this is the smallest one that feeds the lake. It's under a kilometer away from us, so it looks much more big and impressive. But for us here at Maligne, this is an exceptional example of glacial recession. All glaciers everywhere are currently in a recession cycle, a natural cycle that takes place roughly every 5,000 years. If you look immediately above the tree line, there's a large vertical rock face. When an early explorer named Mary Schaefer came here in 1908, this glacier extended all the way down to that vertical rock face, meaning that we've lost a little over 60% of its total volume in the last 100 years, which is very quick. Much quicker than we are ordinarily seeing in our historical records. Reason being is that even though glacial recession is a natural process, as we're coming out of the Wisconsin glacial period, about 9,000 years ago is when that ended. In the last 100 years or so, we've roughly doubled the rate of glacial recession, and it's going to continue to accelerate until they're all gone. That's just how it goes. In another 5,000 years or so, the climate will cool off again, and they'll start to regrow right back in the same places where they are now. Now, you folks might have noticed that we came through a pretty narrow spot in the lake just now. You guys see that? Shore got pretty close. Now, that's a result of our opposing glacial activity on either side of the valley. We do have the Maligne Glacier just up over that ridge there, as we saw earlier, and the Charlton Unwin right here. Now, glaciers are the most powerful erosive forces on our planet. They work their way downhill approximately 2 centimeters every single day. When you're camped below one, which I have been before on these glaciers here, you can hear them cracking and popping at nighttime. They're always moving. They never stop. Great big rivers of ice. And as they're moving down, that immense weight is going to break off chunks of rock from the mountain and send them tumbling on downhill, where they collect here in these funny flat spots that we call alluvial fans. Now out here at Maligne, these opposing alluvial fans are a very wonderful thing for us because they create a bottleneck of the Sampson Narrows there. Now, I asked you guys to take note of the watercolor. Immediately after we passed through the Sampson Narrows, did you notice a difference? We're starting to get more turquoise, right? More of that kind of classic blue that you expect to see in Canadian Rockies lakes. That is a result of our glacial activity as well, and it's going to continue to get more blue the farther south that we go. Good question. So the question was, these boats out here, this is what we call a freighter canoe. Some people, many people in town, own these, and they bring them up here to go fishing. They've got a transom on the back for an electric motor to be mounted. I prefer a traditional canoe myself, but you can buy these or rent these if you're interested in coming up to fish. And you can use them as well to access our backcountry campsites. Just over there, you guys might see some docks sticking off the shore, just some little docks over there. That is our second of 3 backcountry campsites out here at Maligne. This is what's called Fisherman's Bay.
So they keep you in certain areas, you just can't go out and camp anywhere.
That's right. Yeah, you can't go out and randomly camp anywhere. You can absolutely come out here and backcountry camp, but only at one of the 3 backcountry campsites we have, which are permit access only, and frankly, very competitive. And I think you guys know why.
So you have to have a permit to go out. You have to have a permit.
Well, sort of. You have to have a permit to stay overnight.
Okay.
That park says always check.
They don't always check.
Okay.
So how much is your fishing license a year for the locals?
Good question. Fishing license for the year costs $35.20.
If you're a resident.
If you're a resident.